Divorced black nurse insulted by doctor, humiliated before patients. Turns out she's chief of surgery. The hospital corridor erupted into chaos as the privileged young doctor unleashed his fury on the woman he believed was beneath him. Patients gasped, nurses froze, and staff members watched in horror as Dr. Cooper Whitman's racist assumptions turned him into the architect of his own destruction. What he didn't know, what would shatter his arrogance in the most public way possible, was that the nurse he was humiliating was actually the chief of surgery, and she was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. Before we get deep into today's story, I really want to know where you are watching from across the world. Please, drop in the comment section where you're watching. Hit the subscribe button if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have created something very special just for you, another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Once again, you're welcome to Mr. Paul's Stories, where we weave our dreams and hearts together through the magic of stories. Now, let's begin today's story. The fluorescent lights of Mount Sinai Hospital's emergency wing hummed with their familiar electric buzz, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floor that had seen more tears than most people witness in a lifetime. Dr. Blossom Matthews stood in the supply closet, her back pressed against the cold metal shelving, allowing herself exactly 60 seconds to fall apart. Her hands trembled as she clutched the divorce papers that had arrived that morning, final and absolute, like a death certificate for the life she'd once believed in. 12 years of marriage, reduced to legal jargon and custody arrangements. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could perform a flawless craniotomy on a patient's brain, but couldn't repair the fractures in her own heart. Breathe, Blossom. Just breathe. The familiar weight of her stethoscope around her neck felt heavier today, like a chain binding her to a world that demanded she be strong when all she wanted was to crumble. Through the thin walls, she could hear the controlled chaos of the ER, monitors beeping, gurneys rolling, voices calling out medical orders with practiced urgency. This place had been her sanctuary for 15 years, the one constant when everything else in her life shifted like sand. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, careful not to smudge the concealer that barely hid the dark circles beneath them. Sleep had become a luxury she couldn't afford, not with 8-year-old Maya asking why Daddy didn't live with them anymore, not with the mortgage payments that now fell solely on her shoulders, not with the weight of proving herself in a profession that still questioned her presence in its highest ranks. The supply closet door creaked as she pushed it open, stepping back into the bright corridor where her colleagues moved with purpose. None of them knew that beneath her calm exterior, she was drowning. None of them knew that the confident Dr. Matthews they respected was held together by sheer willpower and the desperate need to provide for her daughter. Dr. Matthews. A voice called from behind her. She turned to see Nurse Patricia hurrying down the hall, her face flushed with concern. "We need you in Trauma Bay 3. Multi-vehicle accident, possible internal bleeding." Blossom straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar transformation take place, the shift from broken woman to skilled surgeon, from vulnerable mother to commanding physician. It was a metamorphosis she'd perfected over the years, though lately, the mask felt heavier to wear. "On my way," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. As she walked toward the trauma bay, her reflection caught in the glass doors, a tall, elegant woman in scrubs that somehow looked more professional on her than on anyone else. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark skin seemed to glow under the hospital lights. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had fought for every achievement, every promotion, every ounce of respect in a field that hadn't always welcomed her. But today, something felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that the universe was preparing to test her in ways she hadn't anticipated. As she pushed through the trauma bay doors, ready to save another life while her own felt like it was falling apart, she had no idea that in just a few hours, everything would change. The question that would haunt her for the rest of the day was already forming in the back of her mind. How much more can one person endure before they either break completely, or discover they're stronger than they ever imagined? What do you think drives someone to keep going when everything in their personal life is falling apart? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear about the strength you've found in your darkest moments. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos as the paramedics wheeled in a young woman, her face pale against the bright red blood seeping through the gauze on her abdomen. Blossom's personal turmoil evaporated instantly, replaced by the laser focus that had made her one of the most respected surgeons on the East Coast. "What do we have?" she asked, her hands already moving to assess the patient while the paramedic rattled off vitals. 23-year-old female, driver in a head-on collision. Possible splenic laceration, BP dropping fast, started at 120/80, now down to 90/60. Blossom's fingers moved with practiced precision, palpating the woman's abdomen. The patient's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with terror. "Am I going to die?" she whispered. "Not on my watch," Blossom said firmly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made patients believe in miracles. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma. Emma Rodriguez." "Emma, I'm Dr. Matthews. I need you to stay with me, okay? You're going to be fine." The words came naturally, the same reassurance she'd given to Maya just that morning when her daughter had cried about the divorce. Sometimes being strong for others is the only way to find strength for yourself. As her team moved around her with choreographed efficiency, Blossom caught sight of her reflection in the overhead surgical light. For a moment, she saw not the accomplished surgeon, but the 8-year-old girl from Detroit who had watched her grandmother die because the nearest hospital didn't treat people like them. That little girl had made a promise that day. She would become the doctor her grandmother never had. "Dr. Matthews," called out Nurse Jennifer, a young woman who had become like a daughter to Blossom over the past 3 years. "Or two is prepped and ready." Jennifer was one of the few people who knew about the divorce, who had seen Blossom crying in the break room last week when the custody papers arrived. The young nurse had simply handed her a cup of coffee and sat in silence. Sometimes the most profound support came without words. "Get me Dr. Harrison for anesthesia," Blossom ordered, then turned back to Emma. "We're going to take you upstairs now. I'm going to fix what's broken inside, and when you wake up, you'll have a story to tell about how strong you are." As they rushed toward the elevator, Blossom's mind wandered to Maya, probably sitting in after-school care right now, drawing pictures of houses with only 2 people instead of 3. The guilt gnawed at her. Another late night, another missed bedtime story, another moment of her daughter's childhood sacrifice to save someone else's child. Her phone buzzed with a text from her ex-husband, Marcus. "Maya's recital is Thursday at 7. Try not to miss this one." The passive-aggressive tone made her jaw clench. He had no idea what it cost her to be here, to carry the weight of being the primary breadwinner while he pursued his artistic dreams that had contributed to their financial strain. The elevator doors opened to reveal Dr. Sarah Chun, the hospital's head of cardiology and Blossom's closest friend. Sarah took one look at Blossom's face and knew something was wrong. "Rough day?" Sarah asked quietly as they wheeled Emma toward the OR. "Divorce papers came through this morning," Blossom murmured, low enough that only Sarah could hear. Sarah's expression softened with understanding. She had been through her own divorce 5 years earlier and had been Blossom's anchor during the worst of the separation. "We'll talk after surgery. Dinner at that little place on 82nd. Blossom nodded gratefully. In a world where she often felt isolated by her position and her race, Sarah's friendship was a lifeline. They had met during their residency, 2 women fighting to prove themselves in a male-dominated field, and had supported each other through every triumph and heartbreak since. As they entered the OR, Blossom felt the familiar transformation complete itself. Here, in this sterile sanctuary, she wasn't a divorced single mother struggling to make ends meet. She wasn't the little girl who had been told she wasn't smart enough for medical school. She wasn't the woman whose husband had left because he couldn't handle being married to someone more successful than him. Here, she was Dr. Blossom Matthews, Chief of Surgery, the woman who had performed over 3,000 successful operations, who had pioneered new techniques in trauma surgery, who had saved lives that other doctors had given up on. But as she scrubbed in, watching the pink-tinged water swirl down the drain, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would test more than just her surgical skills. Something in the air felt charged with possibility and danger, as if the universe was preparing to reveal truths that had been hidden too long. The question that haunted her as she stepped into the or wasn't about the surgery ahead. She knew she could save Emma Rodriguez. The question was whether she could save herself from the slow erosion of constantly being underestimated, constantly having to prove her worth, constantly carrying burdens that threatened to crush even the strongest spirit. What she didn't know was that in just a few hours, she would discover exactly how strong she really was. 3 hours later, Emma Rodriguez was stable in recovery, her spleen successfully repaired and her vital signs strong. Blossom emerged from the or feeling the familiar satisfaction that came with saving a life, but the weight of her personal struggles settled back onto her shoulders like a heavy coat. She was making her way to the nurse's station to update Emma's family when she noticed a commotion near the main desk. A young man in a pristine white coat was speaking loudly to one of the newer nurses, his voice carrying the kind of arrogance that made Blossom's skin crawl. "I specifically asked for someone competent to handle my patient's discharge papers," the man was saying, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is completely unacceptable." Blossom recognized him immediately. Dr. Cooper Whitman, fresh out of his residency at Johns Hopkins, son of the hospital board member Dr. Richard Whitman. At 28, he carried himself with the entitled swagger of someone who had never been told no in his life. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, his coat spotless, and his attitude insufferable. The nurse he was berating, Maria Santos, was close to tears. Maria was a single mother of 2 who worked double shifts to support her family, and Blossom had watched her provide compassionate care to countless patients over the past year. "I'm sorry, Dr. Whitman," Maria stammered. The system was running slowly, and— "I don't want excuses," Cooper snapped. "I want competence. Maybe you should consider whether you're really cut out for this job." Blossom felt her jaw tighten. She had seen this scene play out too many times. Young doctors, usually white and male, wielding their authority like a weapon against staff members who couldn't fight back. But today, with her emotions already raw from the divorce papers and the weight of constantly proving herself, something inside her snapped. She approached the desk, her footsteps deliberate and measured. "Is there a problem here?" Cooper turned toward her, his eyes scanning her scrubs with obvious dismissal. He saw what he expected to see, a black woman in nursing attire, someone he could easily intimidate or ignore. "Nothing that concerns you," he said curtly. "This is between me and the nursing staff." "Actually," Blossom said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made several nearby staff members look up, "anything that happens in my hospital concerns me." Cooper's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Your hospital? Listen, nurse." He paused, making a show of looking for a name tag. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm a doctor here. I don't have time to explain hospital hierarchy to someone who clearly doesn't understand it." The words hit Blossom like a physical blow. Not because they were true, but because they echoed every microaggression she had faced throughout her career. Every time someone had assumed she was a nurse instead of a doctor. Every time her expertise had been questioned because of her race or gender. Every time she had been forced to prove herself while her white male colleagues were simply believed. The area around the nurses' station had grown quiet. Patients in nearby chairs looked up from their magazines. Other staff members paused in their tasks, sensing the tension crackling in the air. Maria stood frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "I see," Blossom said slowly, her voice carrying a dangerous calm that those who knew her well would recognize as a warning. "So you think I'm just a nurse? Well, aren't you?" Cooper said with a smirk that revealed his complete confidence in his assumption. "Look, I'm sure you're very good at what you do, taking vitals, changing bedpans, following orders. But right now, I need someone with actual authority to handle this situation." The silence that followed was deafening. Blossom could feel the eyes of everyone around them, waiting to see how she would respond. She thought of Maya, who would grow up in a world where people like Cooper still existed. She thought of her grandmother, who had died because doctors like Cooper's predecessors had deemed her unworthy of care. She thought of every young black girl who might one day stand in this same position, facing the same assumptions and prejudices. But mostly, she thought of herself, the woman who had sacrificed everything to reach the pinnacle of her profession, only to be reduced to someone's narrow-minded expectations based on the color of her skin. Cooper was still smirking, completely unaware that he had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. Around them, the hospital continued its rhythm, monitors beeping, phones ringing, the constant hum of life-saving work. But in this moment, in this small circle of tension, everything had stopped. Blossom took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her chest. For too long, she had absorbed these moments quietly, professionally, choosing her battles carefully to protect her career and her reputation. But today felt different. Today felt like the day she stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent space, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Cooper's smirk widened, clearly expecting an apology or retreat. He had no idea that he was about to learn a lesson that would change not just his day, but potentially his entire approach to medicine. The question hanging in the air wasn't whether Blossom would defend herself. It was how spectacularly Cooper's world was about to be turned upside down. The moment stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Blossom could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, but her exterior remained perfectly composed. Years of navigating hostile environments had taught her to control her reactions, to choose her moments carefully. "Dr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made seasoned nurses straighten their spines, "I think you should know that Maria Santos is one of our most dedicated staff members. She's been working here for over a year, and her patient care scores are consistently in the top 10%. Cooper's expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering across his features. Something in Blossom's tone didn't match his expectations of a subordinate nurse. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but—" "My deal," Blossom interrupted smoothly, "is that I don't tolerate disrespect toward any member of my team." She emphasized the word "my" just enough to plant a seed of doubt. Dr. Sarah Chun appeared at Blossom's shoulder, having witnessed the confrontation from across the hall. Sarah's presence added another layer of complexity to the situation. She was clearly supporting Blossom, which seemed odd if Blossom were just a nurse. "Everything all right here?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Cooper looked between the two women, his confidence wavering slightly. "I was just trying to get some competent help with discharge papers, and this nurse decided to lecture me about hospital policy." "This nurse?" Sarah repeated, her eyebrows rising. "Cooper, do you actually know who you're talking to?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, more staff members had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual tension. Dr. James Morrison from cardiology paused his conversation with a resident. Nurse Patricia stepped closer, her expression a mixture of anticipation and concern. Blossom noticed how the dynamics were shifting. Those who knew her true position were watching with barely concealed anticipation, while those who didn't were simply confused by the unusual standoff between a young doctor and what appeared to be a nurse who commanded unusual respect. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Cooper said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "And I know that I don't have time for this drama. I have real medical work to do." "Real medical work," Blossom repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me, Dr. Whitman, what kind of real medical work have you been doing today?" The question caught Cooper off guard. What does that have to do with anything?" "Humor me," Blossom said, crossing her arms. "I'm curious about your caseload." Cooper's jaw tightened. "I've been handling routine consultations, post-op checks, the usual resident responsibilities. Not that I need to justify my work to someone you assume is beneath you," Blossom finished. "I see." Dr. Martinez from the ER approached the group, having heard raised voices. He took one look at the scene and immediately understood what was happening. His expression grew serious as he positioned himself slightly behind Blossom, a subtle show of support that didn't go unnoticed. "Cooper," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "perhaps you should." "Perhaps I should what?" Cooper snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Listen to a lecture from nursing staff about how to do my job? I don't think so." The words echoed across the now crowded area. Several patients in the waiting area had turned to watch the unfolding drama. Emma Rodriguez's family, who had been waiting for an update, stood near the information desk with confused expressions. Blossom felt the familiar burn of injustice in her chest, but also something else, a growing sense of anticipation. She had spent 15 years building her reputation, earning respect through countless surgeries, research papers, and life-saving decisions. She had mentored dozens of residents, pioneered new techniques, and served on hospital boards. Yet here she stood, being dismissed by someone who had been practicing medicine for less than 2 years. "You know what's interesting, Dr. Whitman?" Blossom said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "I've been watching you since you started here 3 weeks ago." Cooper's expression grew wary. "Watching me? Your surgical technique during the appendectomy last Tuesday was sloppy. Your bedside manner with Mrs. Chun in room 314 was dismissive and unprofessional. And your diagnostic skills during the emergency consult on Friday were questionable at best." The specificity of her observations sent a ripple of surprise through the gathered crowd. How would a nurse have access to such detailed information about a doctor's performance? Cooper's face flushed red. "How dare you?" "How dare I what?" Blossom asked, stepping closer. "How dare I pay attention? How dare I care about the quality of patient care in this hospital? How dare I expect better from someone who took an oath to first do no harm?" Sarah Chun bit back a smile, recognizing the strategic brilliance of Blossom's approach. She was systematically dismantling Cooper's assumptions while building toward a revelation that would be impossible to ignore. "I don't have to listen to this," Cooper said, but his voice lacked conviction. Something in the way everyone was watching him, the way even the other doctors seemed to be supporting this mysterious nurse, was making him increasingly uncomfortable. "Actually," Blossom said, her voice dropping to a tone that commanded absolute attention, "I think you do." The moment had arrived. The tension in the air was palpable, like the seconds before lightning strikes. Everyone present seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, though only some of them understood exactly what. Cooper stood frozen, caught between his arrogance and a growing realization that he had made a terrible miscalculation. The question was no longer whether he would be humiliated, it was how completely his world was about to be turned upside down. What do you think happens when someone's assumptions about others are challenged so dramatically? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's prejudices were exposed in such a public way? Share your thoughts below. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Blossom could see the exact moment when Cooper's bravado began to crack, when the reality of his situation started to penetrate his wall of entitlement. His eyes darted around the circle of faces surrounding them, searching for an ally, for someone who would validate his position. He found none. "You know what I think, Dr. Whitman?" Blossom said, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of expertise and authority. "I think you've made an assumption about me based on what you see rather than who I am." Cooper's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot, but nothing," Blossom interrupted, her patience finally exhausted. "You saw a black woman in scrubs and immediately assumed I was beneath you. You didn't ask my name, didn't inquire about my role, didn't show even basic professional courtesy. You simply decided that your perception was reality." The crowd around them had grown larger. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the hospital administrator, had appeared at the edge of the circle, her expression grave. Several residents who had been working with Cooper watched with wide eyes, finally understanding why their attending physicians had been giving them subtle warnings about attitude and respect. "That's not I didn't. Cooper stammered, but his protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. You didn't what? Blossom pressed. You didn't call me just a nurse in a tone that suggested it was something shameful? You didn't dismiss my concerns about patient care? You didn't assume that because of how I look, I couldn't possibly have authority here. Dr. Sarah Chun stepped forward, unable to contain herself any longer. Cooper, do you want to know who you've been talking to? Sarah, Blossom said quietly, let me. The moment had arrived. Blossom could feel the weight of every person who had ever underestimated her, every patient who had initially doubted her competence, every colleague who had assumed she was an affirmative action hire rather than the most qualified candidate. This wasn't just about Cooper's ignorance. It was about every microaggression, every subtle slight, every time she had been forced to prove herself while others were simply believed. She thought of Maya, who would grow up in a world where moments like this still happened. She thought of her grandmother, who had died because people like Cooper's predecessors had deemed her unworthy of proper medical care. She thought of every young black woman who might one day stand in this same position. Dr. Whitman, Blossom said, her voice carrying across the now silent corridor, allow me to properly introduce myself. Cooper's face had gone pale, as if he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. My name is Dr. Blossom Matthews, she continued, each word falling like a hammer blow. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School. I completed my residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, where I was chief resident. I completed my fellowship in trauma surgery at Johns Hopkins, yes, your alma mater, where I published 12 peer-reviewed papers on innovative surgical techniques. The color drained completely from Cooper's face. Around them, the silence was so complete that the only sounds were the distant beeping of monitors and the soft hum of the hospital's ventilation system. I have performed over 3,000 successful surgeries, Blossom continued, her voice gaining strength with each revelation. I have saved lives that other surgeons gave up on. I have pioneered techniques that are now taught in medical schools across the country. I have mentored dozens of residents and fellows, many of whom now hold prestigious positions at hospitals around the world. Cooper's mouth moved soundlessly. The arrogance that had defined him moments earlier had evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror as he realized the full scope of his humiliation. And most importantly, Blossom said, her voice rising to carry across the entire floor, I am the chief of surgery at this hospital. Which means, Dr. Whitman, that I am your boss. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Emma Rodriguez's family, who had been watching the confrontation with confusion, now stared at Blossom with awe and newfound respect. The patients in the waiting area sat transfixed, witnessing a moment that would become hospital legend. Cooper's legs seemed to give out slightly. He gripped the edge of the nurse's station for support, his face cycling through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and growing panic. I didn't. How was I supposed to? How were you supposed to know? Blossom finished his stammered question. Perhaps by treating every person in this hospital with basic respect and professionalism. Perhaps by not making assumptions based on race and gender. Perhaps by remembering that medicine is supposed to be about healing, not hierarchy. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, his expression serious. Cooper, I think you owe Dr. Matthews an apology. And Maria, Sarah Chun added firmly. You owe Maria an apology too. Cooper looked around the circle of faces, all of them now regarding him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. The residents who had looked up to him were shaking their heads. The nurses who had been intimidated by his attitude were standing taller, emboldened by Blossom's example. Dr. Matthews, Cooper began, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. That's exactly the problem, Blossom interrupted. You had no idea, but you acted anyway. You made assumptions, you showed disrespect, and you created a hostile environment for my staff. The question now is, what are you going to do about it? The weight of the moment settled over everyone present. This wasn't just about one arrogant resident's comeuppance. It was about the systemic assumptions and prejudices that still plagued the medical profession. It was about the courage to stand up and demand better, even when it would be easier to stay silent. Cooper stood there, stripped of his arrogance, facing the consequences of his prejudices in the most public way possible. The question hanging in the air wasn't just whether he would apologize, it was whether he would learn from this moment or let it destroy him. And for Blossom, standing tall in the center of it all, the question was whether this moment of triumph would be enough to heal the wounds that had been accumulating for years, or whether it was just the beginning of a larger reckoning. The aftermath of the revelation should have felt like victory, but as the crowd slowly dispersed and the hospital returned to its normal rhythm, Blossom felt an unexpected emptiness settling in her chest. Cooper had stammered through apologies to both her and Maria, his face burning with shame as he retreated to complete his rounds under the watchful eyes of his supervising attendings. But victory, Blossom was learning, could be a lonely place. 2 hours later, she sat in her office, a spacious corner room on the 7th floor that overlooked Central Park, staring at the divorce papers that seemed to mock her from her desk. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had just asserted her authority as one of the most powerful physicians in New York, yet she couldn't save her own marriage. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Maya's asking why you missed dinner again. I told her you were saving lives, but she's 8, Blossom. She needs her mother." The words hit harder than Cooper's insults had. At least his disrespect had been born of ignorance and prejudice, something external that she could fight against. But Marcus's words carried the weight of truth, and truth was a much more formidable opponent. She had missed dinner. Again. Just like she had missed Maya's soccer game last weekend, and the parent-teacher conference the week before, and countless bedtime stories that had been sacrificed on the altar of her career. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the hospital administrator, stood in the doorway with an expression that made Blossom's stomach clench. "Elizabeth," Blossom said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Come in." Elizabeth closed the door behind her, never a good sign. "We need to talk about what happened downstairs." Blossom felt her defenses rising. "If this is about my handling of Dr. Whitman." "It's not about your handling," Elizabeth interrupted. "It's about the fallout." The word hung in the air like a threat. Blossom had been so focused on the moment of revelation, on the satisfaction of putting Cooper in his place, that she hadn't considered the broader implications. "What kind of fallout?" she asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. Elizabeth sighed, looking older than her 55 years. "Cooper's father called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. He's claiming that you humiliated his son in front of patients and staff, that you created a hostile work environment, and that your emotional state, following your divorce, is affecting your professional judgment." The words hit Blossom like a physical blow. "My emotional state?" His exact words were that a recently divorced woman going through personal turmoil shouldn't be in a position to make decisions that affect patient care and hospital operations. Blossom felt the familiar burn of injustice, but this time it was accompanied by something much worse: fear. Richard Whitman was one of the most influential members of the hospital board, a man whose donations had funded entire wings of the hospital. If he wanted her gone, he had the power to make it happen. "Elizabeth," Blossom said carefully, "you know that's not what happened." Cooper was completely out of line. He disrespected not just me, but Maria and the entire nursing staff. "I know that," Elizabeth said quickly. "And so do most of the board members. But Richard Whitman is persuasive. And he's already started making calls, suggesting that perhaps the stress of your personal life is making you overly sensitive to normal workplace interactions." The phrase "overly sensitive" made Blossom's jaw clench. It was the same dismissive language that had been used to silence women's voices for generations, the same coded words that suggested her reactions were emotional rather than professional. "So what are you saying?" Blossom asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I'm saying that you need to be prepared for a fight. Richard is going to push for a formal review of your position. He's going to argue that today's incident, combined with your recent personal struggles, demonstrates a pattern of poor judgment. Blossom stared out the window at the park below, where families were enjoying the late afternoon sunshine. Somewhere out there, Maya was probably doing homework or playing with friends, wondering why her mother wasn't there to help her with math problems or listen to stories about her day. "There's something else," Elizabeth continued reluctantly. "Richard has been making inquiries about your patient outcomes, your surgical schedules, your time management. He's building a case that you've been distracted, that your personal life is interfering with your professional responsibilities." The accusation was like a knife to the heart because it contained just enough truth to be dangerous. Blossom had been distracted lately. She had been struggling to balance her responsibilities as a single mother with the demands of being chief of surgery. There had been moments when she'd found herself thinking about Maya during surgeries, worrying about custody arrangements during board meetings. "My patient outcomes are exemplary," Blossom said firmly. "My surgical success rate is among the highest in the country." "I know that," Elizabeth replied. "But Richard doesn't care about facts when they don't support his narrative. He's going to paint a picture of a woman who's lost control, who's letting personal emotions cloud her professional judgment." Blossom felt the walls closing in around her. She had worked for 15 years to reach this position, had sacrificed relationships, sleep, and countless personal moments to prove herself worthy of the title chief of surgery. And now, because she had dared to stand up to a privileged young man's prejudices, it could all be taken away. "What do you recommend?" she asked, hating how defeated she sounded. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I think you should consider taking a leave of absence. Let things cool down, let Richard's anger fade. Come back in a few months when the dust has settled." "A leave of absence," Blossom repeated flatly. "You mean run away?" "I mean survive," Elizabeth said gently. "Sometimes strategic retreat is the only way to win the war." But as Blossom sat there, staring at the divorce papers and thinking about Maya's disappointed face, she wondered if there was anything left worth fighting for. She had lost her marriage in pursuit of her career, and now she was on the verge of losing her career because of one moment of standing up for herself. The question that haunted her as Elizabeth left wasn't whether she could survive this latest challenge. It was whether she had already lost everything that truly mattered while fighting battles that might never end. That evening, Blossom sat in her car outside Maya's school, watching her daughter through the window of the aftercare program. Maya was hunched over a coloring book, her small face serious with concentration, occasionally looking up at the clock on the wall. Even from a distance, Blossom could see the disappointment in her daughter's posture, the slumped shoulders of a child who had learned not to expect her mother to arrive on time. The sight broke something inside Blossom's chest. She had been so focused on fighting for respect in her professional life that she had forgotten the most important battle of all, being present for the little girl who needed her most. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah Chen's name appeared on the screen. "I heard about the board meeting," Sarah said without preamble. "Elizabeth told me what Richard Whitman is planning." "Word travels fast," Blossom replied, still watching Maya through the window. "Blossom, you can't let him do this to you. What happened today wasn't about you being emotional or distracted. It was about you standing up to racism and sexism. If you back down now, you're not just letting yourself down, you're letting down every woman and person of color who comes after you." The words stung because they echoed Blossom's own thoughts. But they also felt impossibly heavy. "Sarah, I'm tired. I'm so tired of fighting. I've been fighting my entire career, and for what? My marriage is over, my daughter barely sees me, and now I might lose my job anyway." "Your marriage was over because Marcus couldn't handle being married to a woman more successful than him," Sarah said bluntly. "That's not your fault. And Maya is going to grow up knowing that her mother is a warrior, that she never backed down from doing what was right." Through the window, Blossom watched as Maya looked up at the clock again, then returned to her coloring with renewed focus. There was something in her daughter's determined concentration that reminded Blossom of herself at that age, the little girl who had promised her dying grandmother that she would become the doctor their family had never had access to. "I need to go get Maya," Blossom said softly. "Blossom, wait. There's something else you should know. After you left, something amazing happened." "What do you mean?" The nursing staff started talking. Maria Santos came to me in tears, not because she was upset, but because she was so grateful that someone finally stood up for her. And then other nurses started sharing their own stories about Cooper's behavior. Turns out, today wasn't an isolated incident. Blossom felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in hours: hope. Patricia documented 3 separate incidents where Cooper made inappropriate comments about the nursing staff's competence. Jennifer recorded him questioning a nurse's ability to understand complex medical concepts because of her accent. And Maria has been keeping a journal of every time he's made her feel small and incompetent. The spark grew brighter. Are they willing to come forward? They're more than willing, they're eager. Blossom, you didn't just stand up for yourself today. You gave them permission to stand up for themselves. They want to testify at the board meeting. Blossom closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had been made to feel less than because of someone else's prejudices. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She expected it to be from Marcus, but instead it was from an unknown number. "Dr. Matthews, this is Emma Rodriguez. I heard what happened today. I wanted you to know that you saved my life, and now I understand you're fighting to save others too. If you need someone to speak about your character and competence, I'm here. You're a hero." The message was followed by another, then another. Word of the confrontation had spread beyond the hospital walls, and patients whose lives Blossom had saved were reaching out to offer their support. "Dr. Matthews, you operated on my father last year. He's alive because of you. Whatever you're going through, we're with you. You delivered my baby when 3 other doctors said it was impossible. You don't just save lives, you save families. Fight back. You removed my brain tumor and gave me my life back. Now let us give you something back. We believe in you." Blossom felt tears streaming down her face as message after message poured in. These weren't colleagues obligated to support her or friends trying to make her feel better. These were people whose lives she had touched, who understood the true measure of her worth. She got out of the car and walked into the aftercare center. Maya looked up as she entered, her face lighting up with surprise and joy. "Mommy, you're early." "I am," Blossom said, kneeling down to her daughter's level. "Maya, I need to tell you something important." Maya set down her crayon and gave her mother her full attention, the way she always did when Blossom used her serious voice. Sometimes, grown-ups have to make hard choices. Sometimes we have to fight for what's right, even when it's scary or difficult. And sometimes, the most important thing we can do is stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Maya nodded solemnly. "Like when Tommy was being mean to Sarah at recess, and I told the teacher?" "Exactly like that," Blossom said, her heart swelling with pride. "Tomorrow, Mommy has to go to a very important meeting where some people are going to say things about me that aren't true. They're going to try to make me seem like I did something wrong when I was actually doing something right." "Are you scared?" Maya asked. Blossom considered the question honestly. "A little bit. But you know what I realized? I'm not fighting just for me anymore. I'm fighting for you, and for all the little girls who will grow up to be doctors and nurses and teachers and anything else they want to be. I'm fighting so that when you're older, people will judge you by how smart and kind and capable you are, not by what you look like." Maya reached out and took her mother's hand. "I think you're the bravest person in the whole world." As they walked out of the school together, Blossom felt something she hadn't experienced in months: clarity. The path forward wasn't about choosing between her career and her family, between fighting and surrendering. It was about understanding that some battles were worth everything, and this was one of them. The question was no longer whether she would fight, it was how completely she would win. Have you ever had a moment where you realized that your personal struggle was actually part of something much bigger? Sometimes our individual battles become the catalyst for change that helps others too. What do you think gives people the courage to keep fighting when everything seems stacked against them? The boardroom on the 15th floor of Mount Sinai Hospital had never felt more like a courtroom. Blossom sat at the polished mahogany table, her hands folded calmly in her lap, while around her the most powerful people in New York's medical community prepared to decide her fate. Richard Whitman sat directly across from her, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit a testament to the wealth and influence he wielded. His son Cooper sat beside him, looking pale and uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "we're here today to address a serious incident that occurred yesterday involving Dr. Blossom Matthews and my son, Dr. Cooper Whitman." Blossom watched as Richard painted his version of events, a story in which she was an emotionally unstable woman who had publicly humiliated a young doctor for asking reasonable questions about hospital procedures. He spoke of her recent divorce, her obvious stress, and her pattern of poor judgment that he claimed was affecting patient care. "The evidence is clear," Richard continued, his voice growing more confident as he built his case. "Dr. Matthews has allowed her personal problems to interfere with her professional responsibilities. Yesterday's outburst was simply the culmination of months of declining performance." When he finished, the room fell silent. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, some avoiding Blossom's gaze. She could see the doubt in their faces, the way Richard's carefully constructed narrative had planted seeds of uncertainty about her fitness to lead. Dr. Margaret Foster, the board chair, turned to Blossom. "Dr. Matthews, would you like to respond to these allegations?" Blossom stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She had spent the entire night preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt a strange calm settle over her. "Thank you, Dr. Foster," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Mr. Whitman has painted a very interesting picture of yesterday's events. Unfortunately, it bears little resemblance to what actually happened." She walked to the front of the room, commanding the space with the same authority she brought to the operating theater. "Yesterday, I witnessed Dr. Cooper Whitman verbally abusing a member of my nursing staff. When I intervened, he assumed, based solely on my appearance, that I was a nurse. He then proceeded to dismiss my concerns, question my competence, and treat me with blatant disrespect." Richard's face reddened. "That's a gross mischaracterization." "Is it?" Blossom interrupted, her voice sharp. "Because I have witnesses. Dozens of them." The boardroom door opened, and Dr. Elizabeth Harper entered, followed by a line of hospital staff members. Maria Santos walked in first, her chin held high despite her obvious nervousness. Behind her came Patricia, Jennifer, and 6 other nurses. Dr. Sarah Chun and Dr. Martinez followed, along with several residents and even Emma Rodriguez, still wearing a hospital gown but determined to be present. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This," Blossom said, "is the truth." One by one, the witnesses testified. Maria Santos spoke about Cooper's pattern of disrespectful behavior, her voice growing stronger with each word. Patricia described the hostile work environment he had created. The residents talked about his arrogant attitude and dismissive treatment of nursing staff. But it was Emma Rodriguez who delivered the most powerful testimony. "Dr. Matthews saved my life," she said simply, her voice carrying across the silent room. "3 days ago, I was dying in a car accident. She operated on me for 4 hours, and when I woke up, she was there holding my hand, telling me I was going to be okay. Yesterday, I watched her stand up to someone who was treating her staff badly, and I realized something. She doesn't just save lives in the operating room. She saves dignity, respect, and hope." When the testimonies were finished, the room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Richard Whitman's face had gone from red to ashen as the weight of evidence mounted against his son. Dr. Foster looked around the table at her fellow board members. "Are there any questions for Dr. Matthews?" Dr. James Harrison, a longtime board member, raised his hand. "Dr. Matthews, in your 15 years at this hospital, have you ever had a complaint filed against you for unprofessional behavior?" "No, sir." "Have you ever had a malpractice suit filed against you?" "No, sir." "What is your surgical success rate?" 97.3%, which is among the highest in the country. Dr. Harrison nodded. "And how many lives would you estimate you've saved during your tenure here?" Blossom paused, considering the question. "I don't keep count, Dr. Harrison. But I can tell you that every single patient who comes through those doors receives the same level of care, regardless of their race, gender, economic status, or insurance coverage. That's what medicine is supposed to be about." Richard Whitman stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You're all being manipulated by an emotional woman who—" "Mr. Whitman," Dr. Foster interrupted, her voice ice-cold, "I think you've said enough." The board deliberated for less than 10 minutes. When they returned, Dr. Foster's expression was grave. "After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented," she began, "this board finds no grounds for disciplinary action against Dr. Blossom Matthews. Furthermore, we commend her for maintaining the highest standards of patient care and professional conduct." She turned to Cooper, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings. "Dr. Cooper Whitman, you will undergo mandatory sensitivity training and will be placed on probationary status for the next 6 months. Any further incidents of unprofessional behavior will result in immediate termination." Richard Whitman's face was purple with rage. "This is outrageous. I'll have your jobs for this." "Mr. Whitman," Dr. Foster said calmly, "your resignation from this board will be accepted effective immediately." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Richard Whitman, one of the most powerful men in New York medicine, stood frozen in disbelief. "You can't." "We can, and we have," Dr. Foster replied. "This board will not tolerate attempts to intimidate or remove qualified physicians based on personal vendettas or prejudice." As the meeting adjourned, Blossom found herself surrounded by colleagues, staff members, and patients offering congratulations and support. But her eyes were drawn to the back of the room, where Maya sat with Sarah Chun, having been brought to witness her mother's moment of triumph. Maya ran to her, wrapping her small arms around Blossom's waist. "Mommy, you won." "We all won, sweetheart," Blossom said, lifting her daughter into her arms. "We all won." As they left the boardroom together, Blossom realized that the victory wasn't just about keeping her job or defeating Richard Whitman's prejudice. It was about proving that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it's scary, was always worth the fight. The question that had haunted her for months, whether she could balance being a mother and a surgeon, whether she could fight for respect without losing everything else, had finally been answered. She could do both. She could be both. And she would never stop fighting for either. 6 months later, Blossom stood in the same trauma bay where her journey had begun, but everything felt different now. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light across the bustling emergency department. She was reviewing patient charts when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Dr. Matthews?" She turned to see Cooper Whitman approaching, his demeanor completely transformed from the arrogant young man she had confronted months earlier. His shoulders were less rigid, his expression humble, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before: respect. "Dr. Whitman," she acknowledged with a professional nod. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they had relative privacy. "I know that sounds strange, given everything that happened, but the sensitivity training, the probation, it opened my eyes to things I never saw before." Blossom studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity but finding none. "Go on." "I've been working with Dr. Chun in cardiology, and she's been honest about my behavior. Not just that day, but the pattern of disrespect I showed to nursing staff, to patients who didn't look like me, to anyone I perceived as beneath me. He paused, his voice growing quieter. I was raised to believe that my position, my family name, my education made me superior to others. You showed me how wrong I was. And what have you learned? Blossom asked, genuinely curious about his answer. That medicine isn't about hierarchy or privilege. It's about service. Every person in this hospital, from the janitors to the chief of surgery, is here for the same reason, to heal people. And that the best doctors aren't the ones who demand respect, but the ones who earn it through their actions. Before Blossom could respond, Maria Santos approached with a patient chart. Dr. Matthews, Mrs. Patterson in room 4 is ready for her pre-op consultation. Thank you, Maria, Blossom said warmly. She noticed Cooper's immediate respectful nod to Maria, a stark contrast to his previous dismissive attitude. Dr. Santos, Cooper said, I wanted to apologize again for my behavior. I know I've said it before, but I want you to know that I'm working every day to be better. Maria smiled, the first genuine smile Blossom had ever seen her give Cooper. I can see that, Dr. Whitman. Thank you. As Cooper walked away, Maria turned to Blossom with tears in her eyes. 6 months ago, I was ready to quit nursing because of people like him. Now I'm applying to medical school, and he wrote me a letter of recommendation. The transformation was remarkable, but it was just one of many changes that had rippled through the hospital since that confrontational day. The incident had sparked hospital-wide discussions about respect, bias, and professional conduct. New policies had been implemented, training programs expanded, and a culture of accountability had taken root. Blossom's phone buzzed with a text from Maya, "Good luck with your surgery today, Mommy. I'm proud of you every day. Red heart." The message made her smile. The past 6 months had brought unexpected gifts, including a new custody arrangement that gave her more time with Maya. Marcus, perhaps inspired by her example of standing up for herself, had finally taken responsibility for his role in their marriage's failure and had become a more engaged co-parent. Dr. Matthews? A voice called from behind her. She turned to see Dr. Foster approaching with a young black woman in a white coat. Dr. Foster, Blossom greeted the board chair warmly. I'd like you to meet Dr. Keisha Williams. She's starting her surgical residency here next week, and she specifically requested to work under your mentorship. Dr. Williams stepped forward, her eyes bright with admiration and determination. Dr. Matthews, I've followed your career since I was an undergraduate. Your research on trauma surgery techniques, your advocacy for patient rights, and especially what you did 6 months ago, you've shown me what it means to be both an excellent surgeon and a leader. Blossom felt a familiar tightness in her throat. She remembered being in Dr. Williams' position, young and eager, looking for role models who looked like her in a field that often felt unwelcoming. I'm honored to have you on my team, Dr. Williams, Blossom said. But I want you to know that the path isn't always easy. You'll face challenges, assumptions, and moments when you'll want to give up. I know, Dr. Williams replied. But I also know that you've proven it's possible to overcome those challenges while staying true to yourself. That's the kind of surgeon I want to be. As Dr. Foster and Dr. Williams walked away, Blossom felt a profound sense of completion. The little girl who had promised her dying grandmother that she would become a doctor had not only fulfilled that promise but had become something more, a beacon for others following the same difficult path. Her pager buzzed, calling her to surgery. As she walked toward the OR, she passed the nurses' station where that life-changing confrontation had occurred. The area buzzed with its usual activity, but there was something different in the atmosphere, a sense of mutual respect and collaboration that hadn't existed before. Sarah Chun appeared at her side, falling into step as they headed toward the surgical wing. Ready for the craniotomy? Sarah asked. Always, Blossom replied. How's the patient's family holding up? Nervous, but confident. They specifically requested you after hearing about your success rate. Word of mouth is powerful. As they entered the surgical prep area, Blossom caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was the same person who had stood in that supply closet 6 months ago, crying over divorce papers and feeling like her world was falling apart. But she was also completely different, stronger, more confident, more at peace with who she was and what she represented. The surgery went flawlessly, as Blossom had known it would. As she emerged from the OR 4 hours later, she found the patient's family waiting anxiously in the consultation room. The surgery was a complete success, she told them, watching relief flood their faces. Your father is going to make a full recovery. The patient's daughter, a young woman about Maya's age, looked up at Blossom with tears in her eyes. Thank you for saving my daddy. When I grow up, I want to be just like you. As Blossom drove home that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The confrontation with Cooper had been painful and humiliating, but it had also been necessary. It had forced conversations that needed to happen, changes that needed to be made, and growth that needed to occur. She pulled into her driveway to find Maya waiting on the front porch, homework spread out on the steps, determined to finish before her mother arrived home. How was your day, sweetheart? Blossom asked, settling down beside her daughter. Good. I got an A on my science test, and I told my class about how you save people's lives every day. Tommy said his mom thinks you're a hero. Blossom wrapped her arm around Maya, pulling her close. You know what I think makes someone a hero? What? Standing up for what's right, even when it's scary. Being kind to people who are different from you. Working hard to make the world a little bit better than you found it. Maya looked up at her mother with serious eyes. Then I think you're definitely a hero, Mommy. As they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over their neighborhood, Blossom felt a deep sense of gratitude. The path had been difficult, marked by challenges and heartbreak, but it had led her to this moment, sitting with her daughter, knowing that she had not only survived but thrived, and that her example would inspire others to do the same. The question that had haunted her for so long, whether she could balance being a mother and a surgeon, whether she could fight for respect without losing everything else, had been answered not just in words but in the life she had built. She was Dr. Blossom Matthews, chief of surgery, devoted mother, and living proof that sometimes the most important victories come not from avoiding the fight, but from standing tall in the middle of it and refusing to back down. And as Maya snuggled closer to her side, Blossom knew that the greatest surgery she had ever performed was the one she had done on her own life, removing the fear, repairing the confidence, and healing the parts of herself that had been broken by others' expectations. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise, and for the first time in years, Blossom couldn't wait to see what came next. As we reach the end of Blossom's journey, I'm curious about your own experiences with standing up for what's right. Have you ever had a moment where you had to choose between staying silent and speaking up, even when it felt risky? What gave you the courage to make that choice? Share your story below. Your experience might inspire someone else who's facing their own difficult decision.